All right, everyone, we're going to get started a couple minutes early because Congressman Kilmer has to get back to go vote, so everyone could take their seats. Welcome to What's Next for Open Data in the United States. I wanted to get things started off really quickly here with opening remarks from Congressman Kilmer, who was one of the several co-sponsors of the Open Government Data Act, but we're particularly grateful that he's here because his office was actually the first to reach out in 2015 to ask what an open data bill would look like. And after a lot of heartbreak, we are finally here. It finally passed. So please join me in welcoming Congressman Kilmer.
Good to see you. Hello. I feel like I should apologize for the heartbreak. That's a really tough, It
was not your fault.
It's really hard to hear. It's great to be with you. Thanks, everybody, for coming. I was asked to give an update on what's going on in Congress, which I'm reticent to do because many of you may have recently eaten. But I actually get to talk about some good news that is probably good for digestion, and that's talking about more and better access to data. And that's exciting to me for a whole lot of reasons. When we set up our office, we did so with one mission statement, and that was creating more economic opportunity for more people in more places. And government data that's easy to find helps Americans invest in new technologies and start new businesses and create new jobs. And expanding that access to data will help people, not frankly just in the shadow of the Space Needle of Seattle, but even in some of the rural parts of my district. It means one less barrier to entry for folks to get in on the growth that's happening in urban areas. It means anyone who has the right skills and the right infrastructure that they need to run a business, including access to high-speed internet, can actually now get some of the raw materials that they need to start one and to have a successful one. And that's why we wrote this bill called the Open Government Data Act. And as was mentioned, I'm really happy that after some fits and starts, it ended up with strong bipartisan support and was signed into law. And I'm excited about that for a lot of reasons. It means that government data, that the mass amount of government data will now be, more of it will be machine readable, more of it will be in a searchable format. It opens the world to more government data as much as possible without compromising intellectual property or our security. But simply put, Open Government Data Act gives the data the government collects to the people who paid for it, and that's all of you. So passing this bill was important, and for one, it can help make government more accountable. For example, I represent more military veterans than any Democrat in Congress, and many of them wait far too long to get the care that they have earned and that they deserve from the Veterans Administration. And when we look at a bill like the Open Government Data Act, or a law now, we think that it could help lawmakers and the public keep better tabs on wait times and the ability to access VA care in a clinic in our districts. It means the press can keep a closer eye on it too. I just met with a group of school teachers from my district, and we talked a little bit about how the vast amounts of data on schools could help policymakers understand where they need to focus to make sure our kids are learning the skills that they need to compete in a 21st century economy. Which brings up a great point, and that is the bill passed because people across the increasingly wide political spectrum know that making government access to data, making that more accessible is a good idea. It means the government can use empirical evidence when making policy decisions, evidence-based policy making. Seems like a good idea, right? It means we have an opportunity to better protect the interests of taxpayers, to eliminate expensive programs that may just not be working, that may not be performing, to eliminate duplication. It means the press and transparency groups can arm themselves with facts that they need to speak truth to power more easily. And given our setting, perhaps most importantly, it means opportunity for innovators, because it gives them a chance to compete with more established businesses in the industry. And I want to spend a little time on the job creation and innovation element of this. There are a ton of cool examples of how government data is already used, and one that we all probably used this morning when we left our apartments or our homes, and that is the amount of weather data that's collected from NOAA that has led to collaboration between the public sector and private sector, and now all sorts of new weather apps, most of which are telling me not to try to fly home on Friday night because of snow in Seattle. I curse them. But there's not just cool innovation as a consequence of that. It's actually lowered the economic and human costs of weather-related damage through more accurate forecasting, and that's a good thing. Additionally, app developers are using federal highway data to figure out sources of gridlock and traffic in our communities. Local governments can use that same data to evaluate which infrastructure investments could make the greatest difference, that could ease the lives of commuters. How many of you have sat in traffic lately? I'm pretty sure in most of the D.C. metropolitan area, and certainly along the Interstate 5 corridor in Seattle, the speed limit signs are only there for nostalgic purposes. And anything that actually might cure that is something I'm enthusiastic about. So, germane to the topic, what's next? So going forward, we have some opportunities. One, we have some opportunities to work with the administration to ensure strong implementation of this bill that has now become law. In that bill, we set up chief data officers for federal agencies, and we should pay attention to how those roles are defined and make sure that lessons are shared among agencies. We should encourage leadership from the executive branch on identifying and incorporating other open data best practices across government. Congress should continue to work toward unlocking open data and supporting data standardization in government. There are some terrific bills out there that continue to move the needle on this. The GREAT Act, of which I am a co-sponsor, the wonderfully wonky named the Access to Congressionally Mandated Reports Act. It's a real page-turner, you guys, but that furthers the goal by making data more accessible and searchable and more usable by innovators and by communities and by the American people who have paid for that data. So, I guess in a nutshell, and I apologize that I got to go run and vote, passing the Open Government Data Act was a big step, but it wasn't the last step in this, and I know that's going to be the conversation that comes for the rest of the afternoon. So let me just end by saying thank you for your partnership. More than anything else, I'm here to say thank you for the work you're doing, for everyone who's invested in this effort. I want to just say I'm eager to continue to be your partner, and I think together we can push Congress and this administration to help you innovate and create jobs and create more economic opportunity for more people in more places. So keep it up. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Good luck, you guys.
Appreciate it. Thanks. Thank you very much, Congressman. So it's great to see that we have a full house, but there are still a couple seats open up in the front if anyone wants to take them, and one or two seats up here. My name is Joshua New, and I'm a senior policy analyst at the Center for Data Innovation. I would like to thank all the co-sponsors that helped us put on this event, including BSA, the Software Alliance, the Internet Association, SPARC, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Data Coalition, and the American Library Association, obviously a very diverse group that is all interested in supporting open data. Their work and the work of others in the open data community has been invaluable in helping get this legislation passed. So, on January 14th, President Trump signed H.R. 4174 into law. It's the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, Title II of which is the Open Government Data Act, which is why we're all here today. And this was a major milestone for open data because it requires the federal government to treat its data as open by default, which they've been sort of doing in practice, not necessarily mandated to do since 2013. But it almost didn't happen. This bill came close to the finish line many times, as we alluded to, and our hopes were dashed at the last second more than once. And then we've had time to realize that it actually did happen. We're letting it sink in. We've had some time to celebrate. But now we're faced with the new and arguably more important task of figuring out what actually comes next. If the Open Government Data Act is going to be the foundation for open data policy in the United States, how do we build on this foundation to increase the value and utility of open data for businesses, for the public sector, for academics, for journalists, for anyone that wants to use this data for economic or social innovation? How do we address implementation challenges so that open data is common practice rather than just some unattainable ideal? So to help answer these questions and more, I'm very happy to be joined by Nick Hart, who's the director of the Evidence Project for the Bipartisan Policy Center. Then we have Christian Hayner, who is the policy director for the Data Coalition. Then we have Nick Shockey, who is the director of programs and engagement for SPARC. Next to him, we have Ala Seifert, the director of cloud policy and counsel at the Internet Association, and the only person not named Nick or Christian on the panel. And then finally, we have Christian Troncoso, the Director of Policy for BSA, the Software Alliance. So to get things started, to kind of lay the groundwork here, we know that the Open Government Data Act, writes, treat open by default into law. But beyond that, what are the major provisions of the Open Government Data Act actually do, and why are they significant? Why is it so important that we actually have a law saying these things now? So I'm going to kick it off to the Christians to take it away for this one, but anyone else feel free to jump in.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. We're really excited that this is now law, and I think the success of this bill will be determined by the community's efforts to stay together and keep working on our various projects and working and communicating together. So it took a lot of groups to get it here, so it's going to take a lot of groups to bring it into fruition. But I guess just to kick off here, this bill was written to largely codify the 2013 executive order for an open and machine-readable government.
Yep.
And,
could you speak into the mic?
Sorry.
Yep, thanks.
And those were largely the first time that open data principles had been kind of codified in federal policy. So I just want to rehash what those principles are because they're so important, and they've been guiding a lot of the Trump and Obama administration's work, kind of like behind the background that we'll get into later. But there's 7 of them. Data should be complete. It should be collected at the primary level, so source level data. It should be timely, so it's quickly available, accessible to the widest range of users, machine processable, so computers can read it, interpret it, allow automation. It should be non-discriminatory, so it should be available to everyone. It should be non-proprietary, so people can reuse it, and then it should be license-free to allow people to build off of it. So those practices were embedded in the M1313 executive order and the management guidance that accompanied it. And Project Open Data, shared between OMB and GSA, has been keeping this work going for the past 5 years. And a lot of people deserve a lot of credit for keeping that alive. The bill was originally drafted in 2014 and introduced, and what we now see, and we'll get into this, is a law that codifies a lot of definitions. So we have a definition for machine-readable, and we're already taking that and putting it into other bills so that we stop collecting information in unusable formats, and we get it in the right format from the get-go. It codifies just data asset, codifies public data asset, and that's the most critical because it tells the government now that there should be a presumption of openness. If it can be disclosed or should be disclosed or is subject to the Freedom of Information Act, then it needs to then be made available in open formats and in machine-readable formats. So pay attention to those definitions in the first part of the law. It then has a lot of agency responsibilities. So the OMB director will issue guidance to help with kind of guiding this, but agencies are responsible to that guidance and to basically take this open data, map it to agency inventories, and disclose it for public use. So there'll be a lot of data management activities going on, discovery and mapping, and then all of that will be rolled up into the federal data catalog that GSA will maintain, and that's pretty much data.gov, which I think 2 people here have been keeping that alive and well for the number of years. So those are kind of the big parts and the responsibilities for the agencies, and those all kind of align with the executive order from 2013. And the other Christian's going to kind of tell you what's new because we need someone to actually do the work.
Thanks. Yeah, we were very pleased to see Congress codify the Open Data Initiative that OMB had been overseeing for several years, but I think there are at least a few aspects of the Open Government Data Act that go even beyond what was in that original OMB guidance that I think are going to be important going forward. Probably most important, and Congressman Kilmer alluded to it earlier, is that the bill now requires that every agency have a chief data officer who is going to be responsible for quarterbacking every agency's implementation of the Open Government Data Act. That's really significant because so far, in the past, compliance with the OMB directive had fallen largely to chief information officers who generally are responsible for overseeing the IT infrastructure of each agency. So as you can imagine, they're already stretched pretty thin. Sort of giving them this whole new mandate really was somewhat unreasonable, and I think had a lot to do with why we've seen sort of sporadic and inconsistent implementation of the OMB guidance. So we're really hopeful that the chief data officers that will be, that every agency will now have, will serve as sort of evangelists within the agencies, helping them realize that this is not just a sort of a cost center for the agency, but potentially a real opportunity to improve constituent services and their ability to deliver on the agency's mandate. In addition, it also creates a Chief Data Officers Council, which is going to provide opportunities for all the CDOs from the agencies to get together and come up with harmonized approaches for data governance processes, and for things as simple as, what sorts of metadata do we want to use when we're identifying the data that is available in our data inventories. And then I think the third real achievement of this bill that I think surpasses what was in the 2013 OMB memo relates to the data inventory itself. That was a core aspect of the original OMB memo and the executive order that gave rise to it. But one of the differences that was included in the Open Government Data Act is that it now includes a provision that essentially says every agency needs to include in their data inventory any data asset that would otherwise be subject to a FOIA request. So that's going to, I think, make these data inventories a lot more robust and a lot more useful to researchers as they're trying to identify what data an agency has that might not be currently made available through data.gov. And that's been one of the real challenges for researchers and for an industry to date. So.
Great. Before we move on, in the excitement to get started, I skipped over some housekeeping I wanted to mention. So as a reminder, this is live streaming on our website at datainnovation.org. Please feel free to live tweet, or if you're watching online, tweet in your questions to @DataInnovation and use the hashtag DataInnovation, and all of our speakers' Twitter handles are listed up on the screens beside you. And also, we're going to leave about 20 minutes at the end for audience Q&A, and I promise to get everyone out of here right at 2:30. So a little bit more legwork before we get into the discussion. I'm actually hoping, Nick, you could take this away here. Could you give us a little bit of the history of the bill and how this kind of got wrapped up into a much broader legislative push for evidence-based policymaking in the past year or two?
Sure. So I guess roughly at the time the Open Bill was being drafted, there was also a parallel effort happening to create something called the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking. So it was an effort championed by then Speaker Paul Ryan and Senator Patty Murray. And it was a group of Republicans and Democrats that have been appointed to basically study some of these similar questions around how do we make government data more accessible, recognizing government collects a lot of data and we often don't use it to its full effect. So the data that commission was largely tapped with studying were things that were highly sensitive, where there's personal identifiers or business identifiers, things that we may not actually want to be out freely open and available. And there are a lot of reasons for that are important. The commission spent about a year studying the charge that was given to them by Congress, and then came out with a set of unanimous recommendations at the end of 2017. And at that point, that created a legislative momentum around what we now know as the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, which was the bigger vehicle that included the final Open Bill. And it was a really cool opportunity to really sync together some of these conversations that were happening around confidential data, things that have personal identifiers that we still need and want to be able to analyze to answer important questions, and then some of the data that we actually can make publicly accessible. I think one of the really great features is when you take the bill in its totality, we'll actually see more data pushed from the sort of confidential space into an open space, because we're increasingly developing approaches where we can de-identify more and more data sets, make more public use data files, sort of with having in mind privacy protections and all of the current risks that exist out there for re-identifying people and businesses. But I think the combination of these two acts is a really powerful statement about the potential that now exists for accessibility across a whole spectrum of government data that had not emerged in quite a long time. I think this is something that many of us have been talking about for years or decades. I guess I would just echo the enthusiasm that we hear from the broader evidence community and the research community, the evaluation communities, about the potential of the entirety of the bill working together to really bolster the information that policymakers, Congressman Kilmer and others will have as we go forward.
Great. And speaking of communities, I want to highlight just how broad the support for this kind of legislation is. We have civil society, business, academics, researchers, all on board with this. And we have all those groups represented on the panel here today. So could each of you kind of describe what this means for the communities that you represent and why this is such a major achievement?
Sure, I can start. So my name is Ala. I'm the not Nick or Christian on the panel. And I'm with the Internet Association. We are over 45 mostly consumer-focused technology companies. And I think GPS and weather are really great, I think, more traditional examples of open data. But the business community that is cloud native and looking at a lot of innovation is going to be using this data, I think, to move the ball forward with respect to either existing business lines or innovating and inventing new things altogether. So it's really exciting. I think it's going to be a boon to American businesses.
So my name's Nick. I'm from SPARC, and I'm really excited to be here because I think we also represent sort of a somewhat unique perspective. SPARC's a global coalition committed to making open the default for research and education, and our core membership base are actually academic and research libraries, and we are big on definitions. So I was really glad that Christian started us off by going through the definitions in the Open Government Data Act, because I think that's one of the really strong points in this legislation for us. Specifically, we feel that the provisions around open licensing and putting a really strong definition for what open license means is very important, as well as specific and powerful definitions of machine readability that for us lay a really important foundation for further policy making around research data specifically.
Great. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think I'm with BSA, the Software Alliance. We represent a lot of mostly enterprise-facing software companies, so companies like Oracle and IBM and Microsoft, some of which obviously have a consumer-facing line as well. I think that our companies view the Open Government Data Act from sort of two perspectives. The first is that as companies who provide data services, they're very excited by the opportunity to partner with the government to improve the government's own uses of data, to improve the government's ability to provide public services. The second perspective is as companies who are on the forefront of the development of artificial intelligence, they see that the government has a lot of very valuable data, NOAA data, for instance, that had been referenced earlier, a lot of geospatial data that is going to be really important for many different aspects of machine learning and artificial intelligence development. So increasing the availability of this type of data is the sort of second order benefit of the bill from our company's perspective.
Great.
Can I add in here?
Of course.
So I guess let me just give two illustrative examples that I think are why this is a really clear win for the research community. So we don't know what data government currently has. I mean, this is a fundamental problem for a researcher that's trying to answer questions that policymakers want answers to. We've had a very good and solid attempt through M1313 a number of years ago to develop a comprehensive data inventory, but there are big problems that we know need to be fixed. So like the Census Bureau, for example, has some data that they receive from other agencies. The other agencies may not have reported it on their inventory because they gave it to the Census Bureau. The Census Bureau didn't report it because it wasn't their data. I mean, this is a really unique opportunity to fix what's kind of a silly problem. Let's just be totally honest. We can solve this, and that's one of the really great things about the structure and the really clear messaging that's happening here from Congress and now the President. Agencies are expected to tell us what data they collect. And from a research perspective, if I know what data government has, I can make use of those data. And as we use more data, we also learn about the limitations and the data quality challenges, so our data get better over time. I mean, if that's not a clear win for researchers, I don't know what is.
Sure.
And I'll just close out. The Data Coalition, we represent kind of the data industry, so it's kind of three types of companies, if you will. Ones that are really concerned about open data and transparency because they want to help open up and either understand the information the government has for market analysis for investors, or whether they want to help create visualizations like Click and Tableau in our group. Also, we have companies that help the private sector report to the government. So they're like kind of preparing the filings and everything, and if there's a structure they can map to, they can make that more of an intuitive experience, kind of like the TurboTax of whatever, if you will. And then lastly, we have a lot of consultancies that really want to help with the change management, internal reporting, and mapping of data assets. So, this is going to create a lot of work and a lot of good work and abilities to find efficiencies. So we'll get into some other legislation later on, but very excited for kind of what this opens up.
Great. So, as we mentioned, open by default has been kind of the de facto law of the land since M1313, dating back about 6 years now. But there were some growing pains then, and I expect there are going to be a lot more growing pains now that it's a legal mandate. So, I guess, Ala, if you want to take it away from here, what are some of the challenges that we can expect agencies to face as they actually go about implementing some of these things, and what are the timeline for these challenges that they have to overcome?
Sure. So I guess a little bit of background. I just left government 3 months ago. So I think to the extent that I think uniquely understand the battles that have been waged in the civic technology space, I want to quickly give a shout out to folks in this room and I think who are live streaming who have been running things like data.gov, both as government employees and as vendors. I think y'all have been doing a really tremendous job over the years. And I think I'm just particularly sensitive to the fact that this is a very long-term transformation and change management effort that is going on throughout government. And so to the extent that this law now finally gave many agencies the authorities they felt like they needed before they were allowed to move forward, this is going to, I think, help folks that wanted to move forward even quicker. And I think a good example of a similar maybe change management effort that has gone on was Treasury's implementation of the Data Act. And to the extent that ultimately this is not a technology problem, a lot of government implementation of these complex, thorny policy issues is a people problem, and it's a process problem, or not problem, opportunity, I guess. I think there was really tremendous work done on the Data Act in particular with helping, with ensuring that program was really user-centered in the way the policy was implemented. So that was using human-centered design and agile principles, which are traditionally used for software development, and really bringing that to the implementation of the policy itself. So now we've got this law. This is really exciting. Agencies finally have the authority they need to move forward. But as they move forward, I think thinking about bringing human-centered design and all the sort of best practices in evidence-based policymaking and thinking about the end user is really going to help the final implementation be useful for the communities I think we all talked about us representing.
So, Christian, I know, Christian H., I know you, the Data Coalition was very involved in Data Act implementation as well. Are there any specific challenges that you foresee that might slow down even the best-intentioned agency? Like, for example, the bill requires agencies to publish data by default, but it doesn't give them funding to actually do so. I mean, is it going to be simply just a procurement challenge, or are there other kind of cultural or even stakeholder challenges in play here?
Yeah, the Data Act was really about transparency of federal spending, but to get there, you had to do a lot of standard settings work. The Treasury had to get 100 agencies to all agree to a common definition for what a federal account is and what spending looks like, and then that had to be mapped into all of their accounting software. So, there was appropriations in dollars for Treasury and OMB for the implementation of that. It's a little muddled as to what was actually given out to the agencies. Even though there was a cost score of about $290 million for it over 3 years. But I think one of the lessons learned there just on the resources side was that the Treasury was very effective at leveraging a lot of fellows and GSA's 18F to kind of bring in and do an agile approach. And pushing out monthly updates allowed agencies to kind of get on a heartbeat and push kind of proactively problems up to Treasury. So that agile approach was very important to keeping it kind of efficient and on time. But also the software vendor community really came in, and they did a lot of the heavy lift too in terms of making sure that what they were selling to the government was actually ready to deal with this. And I know a big shout out to like CGI Federal and SAP for doing a lot of that work. So yeah, I think aside from those things, that was a standard setting project, and Treasury was kind of in charge of maintaining the standard, but it did take OMB and their management authority, to issue guidance and directives to the agencies to comply. So I think we have to look at partnerships of government-wide policy setting agencies and making sure that everyone's strengths and statutory authorities are leveraged.
I think two of the challenges that I foresee are going to be things that the chief data officers are going to have an integral role in helping to overcome. The first is just sort of the natural bureaucratic aversion to openness. There's, I think, naturally a tendency within government or any other large institution to favor risk aversion and opacity, and not necessarily people take a sort of siloed view of what they're working on and don't necessarily appreciate the fact that the data that they may be generating in the course of a project could also be helpful to their colleagues within their own agency, certainly, but then to their colleagues across government as well. And so the CDOs are going to have a really important role in sort of changing the culture within government on these sorts of issues. And then I think one of the more forward-looking issues that the CDOs are going to be helpful with is in helping to reform procurement processes and their approaches to contracting with outside vendors, ensuring that any contracts that agencies enter into with vendors include provisions that enable the government and the agency to make the most productive uses of their data possible, ensuring that data is not locked up on the vendor side, and rather that the agency is able to retain that data and the data that is built on top of it.
Great. So speaking of chief data officers, some agencies have had these already, but most of them don't, which seems weird to me for just such a massive enterprise with IT resources. Is the requirement to designate a chief data officer actually significant, or is it just a CIO under another name? What does it actually mean in terms of responsibilities? What are they going to be actually doing in part of the Chief Data Officers Council that is different than what agencies might have already been doing? Christian or anyone else?
So I would say the fundamental difference here is that it's inherently not about IT systems. It's about data quality, data management, data stewardship. And so, and that's not to say CIOs have never played a role there. Of course, there's a very important role they've played for a long time. But this is a new leadership role for most agencies to specifically focus on the data. And I think the reason that's so significant is because if we can plan better when we're collecting data at the starting point, for whatever the use is going to be, we can actually make them more useful. So if we're going to burden the American public from a government perspective and require data collections, ask for voluntary information, we need to be able to make sure that we can use it for whatever the intended purpose is. And when data have low quality, they have limited utility. So I think the CDOs are going to have a really instrumental role in just changing the nature of the kinds of data that we're collecting and the nature of them to make all of our information better. And I mean, that's ultimately what Representative Kilmer was talking about, having good information for decision making, and I think that's a game changer.
And I have a nerdy procurement-centric nugget of information, which is I think that to the extent that the Chief Data Officer can really leverage the authorities granted to CIOs through the FTAR legislation, there's an opportunity for CDOs to plug into the acquisition, the IT acquisition approval process. And to Christian's point earlier, how can CDOs ensure that the systems that are being bought aren't closed by default, or that that the data that is in a system is exportable in a machine-readable way? I think there's a real opportunity for CDOs, wherever they may be in an agency, whatever the reporting chain looks like, but for them to become allies of and really team players in the FTARA approval process for IT acquisition projects to make sure that the data is there. Because I think that's subject matter expertise that to the extent that CIOs are really looking for risk, ultimately FISMA makes them responsible for all the IT risk. They may not necessarily, and their offices may necessarily be adequately staffed to do a lot of the data assessment. So I think there's a real opportunity there to think about open data.
Yeah, and I would just add the extent to which the CDOs can posture themselves as that kind of internal help desk or clearinghouse of internal information problems. I think that's where they'll start amassing a lot of influence through the time they're saving their colleagues. And if you notice one part of your agency's collecting information for one purpose and another one is kind of doing about 30% of that work towards another directive, get them together so they can leverage each other's work and apply common platforms for visualization and analysis.
Sure. So for the open data community, for the past couple of years, most of the political capital has been about actually making sure this data is available to be used. But now that we have this bill, I think we can start shifting towards actually using this data. How do we actually make sure it's applied correctly or in useful ways or in ways that actually benefit people? Nick, if you wanted to start, could you describe how, now that we have open data kind of codified into law, how that might play into things like the federal data strategy that we can expect coming out hopefully soon?
Yeah, so hopefully soon. So if you're not aware of the federal data strategy, I encourage you to go to strategy.data.gov. You can learn all about it. But in short, it's a really interesting idea out of this administration to develop a long-term plan to address many of the things that we're talking about and more. I have to give the administration a lot of credit because they've recognized that we can't fix many of our data challenges overnight. Some of these are going to take years. Some of them may unfortunately still take decades. And that's the whole point of having this strategy. So over the course of the last year, the Office of Management and Budget and other agencies have been working to develop this really comprehensive look at addressing core data issues, including open data themes. And actually, I think it'll be largely the implementation vehicle that we'll see over the next year for really taking some steps to tackle what this new law does. Unfortunately, OMB was among the agencies that were shut down when government was not operating, so the timeline is a little bit unclear currently of when we'll actually see the strategy come out, though I think we can safely expect it in coming months. And when it comes out, it'll be in a draft form, so everyone will be able to take a look and provide comments to OMB to ultimately make it a stronger, more useful product. And the point of that document is, again, so that we can make use of government data. I mean, that is ultimately the goal. So if you've got a particular topical area or functional area of some part of government that you're interested in, the data strategy is going to be really important to make sure that this law and what we're seeing happen across government agencies are staying in sync.
Great. Anyone else? Sure. Well, in that case, speaking of government shutdowns, we just came out of one, and this is not the first one that we've had since we've had an open data policy in the United States. The last one we saw a lot of open data portals go offline. We saw similar things happen this time around. Not quite as bad, but a lot of federal portals were offline, or some federal data assets or tools weren't available or had reduced functionality. The original version of this bill had a provision that made the publication of open data an accepted activity, so something that is so crucial to the economy that we still have to do it during a shutdown, in the same vein that we still pay soldiers during a shutdown. How can we kind of hedge against those kind of barriers to open data in the future, and why are they so important to address? Like, why does this matter for a business that uses open data if the government shuts down? In addition to all the other reasons why a shutdown could be problematic.
I mean, I think fundamentally, if you're a company who has built a business that relies on access to updated government data, and that data suddenly becomes unavailable due to a government shutdown, that creates obvious challenges. So, I mean, I think we are going to have to grapple with that. I don't know if that's going to require sort of additional legislation to ensure that if there, God forbid, are future government shutdowns, that data.gov doesn't go down. I think that's going to be a huge priority and increasing one as more businesses leverage government data because of the Open Government Data Act.
Sure.
And I would just say, the aspect of the Open Government Data Act that, practically allows for bulk download is so critical in that environment, because if you kind of anticipate stuff going offline, you can at least get what's there. and mash it up and, use it on your own systems, and not be relying on an API that gives you kind of a structured view of the underlying data assets.
I agree and build on Christian's point that, one of the reasons, again, we're so supportive of this legislation is the strong definition of open licensing. And I think, signaling up front that there shouldn't be any restrictions on reuse, will allow, organizations like libraries and archives, in addition to businesses and others, to crawl and bulk download the data and have copies accessible.
Great.
Well, I guess I'll maybe say the obvious answer here, which is our elected leaders can't let government shut down, right? So, the data that are being produced here are so valuable for our society. Government is playing a really important role. Think about weather data. What would happen if we didn't have access to weather data? There would be real implications for that in our society. Our elected leaders can't let these data go without being accessible. They're just too important.
Everyone tweet that. We talked a lot about the definitions of the bill. And the bill defines data as recorded information regardless of form or media on which the data is recorded. So people normally think about data as rows in a spreadsheet, a bunch of numbers. But conceivably, this could cover things like source code that the government developed. So Christian, I know we had talked a little bit about this. Does this bill have any bearing on how the government publishes source code, or could it in the future?
I think it could, but you also should recognize that in 2016, OMB had put out a federal source code policy that answers a lot of these sort of questions, and I think does so in ways that are pretty complementary to the objectives of the Open Government Data Act. So one of the most important aspects of the federal source code policy is a requirement that when agencies are developing custom code in-house, that they should they've launched a pilot project that requires them to make at least 20% of that code available in open source. So that is another sort of project that's underway that, hints at the increasing awareness of the value of open data in general. But that project itself is going through some growing pains. And so, I think there needs to be continued attention there to see what challenges the agencies are having in complying with that requirement. One thing we've observed is that there's a little bit of confusion within the agencies about the best open source licensing mechanisms to use in order to make their code available through existing open source projects. There are some agencies whose general counsels are saying because government created content is not subject to copyright protection, they're unable to rely on conventional open source licenses, which are structured around this idea that there is a copyrighted element to what is being licensed. So these are just some of the challenges I think that we'll increasingly confront as we move our government in the direction of openness.
Sure. So on that note, we talked a little bit how there's a resistance to kind of openness in bureaucracy generally, that there's a need to kind of cultivate a more data-focused culture within federal agencies. But on that note, where the problem seems to be just a lack of awareness about how to actually go about this correctly, and they don't have a lot of necessarily precedent in the government to do this, how can we as advocates, as civil society, as representatives of industry, be a resource to these communities? What are the major problem areas that we can kind of target for education or maybe making user guides or toolkits for these agencies interested in supporting open data?
With the Data Act, we've had a lot of talk about, the data quality issues. That'll be a kind of a persistent problem, but they'll probably solve themselves quicker if the agencies are aware of how their data is being used. And you talk about conspicuous use by intermediary institutions as where Treasury and OMB should be focusing. And open data for government purposes is something we're paying attention to at the Data Coalition. There's a lot of .govs going to usaspending.gov and pulling that information. And if Congress is using it, Congress is a representative body of the public, and that's you can focus on those institutions and empower them to use resources across the government.
I think putting myself back in 3 months ago when I was in government, I think there's a lot of opportunity for civil society groups to provide a fair amount of education and resources sort of asynchronously for government employees as they think about licensing. That open source, is it government data that's not subject to copyright, but what license do I use when I publish it on GitHub? Like, that dichotomy isn't new, and that's sort of like being stuck between a rock and a hard place for some program offices has very much been a lived experience, and I think there's an opportunity for civil society to do some writing, some advocacy, some education efforts around what we'd like to see there, as well as just general examples of, like, actually, if your contract says this, you won't go to jail, and neither will your contracting officer. So whether it's sample contract language or sample terms of service, whatever it is that folks want to use.
I guess I might add that one thing, just picking up on your comment about advocacy, moving forward, agencies are going to have a lot of priorities that they have to deal with in terms of this bill, as well as everything else that they're doing through the course of daily operations. I think one important thing for the stakeholder community that's interested in open data is to make sure that whatever agencies you care about the most know that this is a priority and that you can be a resource for them as they're struggling with dealing with some of these really tricky implementation questions. I think there are an endless list of things that are going to come up as we move to the next phase of implementation. And in some cases, we can't even necessarily predict those. And I'm sort of projecting this just based on some of the emails that I've gotten from federal agencies in the last several weeks about this law. And they're running into really tricky questions already, and they're really complicated. And that's because everybody has other statutory authorities that they're operating in. They've got resource constraints, and they've got leaders with a whole host of priorities. So I think the best thing as a stakeholder group or stakeholder community that we can do is just make sure this is a continued priority for federal agencies moving forward.
To build on that, I think SPARC might be sort of an interesting organization in this space, and that our focus is on open specifically. And a number of years ago, we realized that we needed to actually do better about communicating the concrete benefits of open. And one of the sort of tools that we came up with to do that is we sort of constantly come back to this phrase and idea of open in order to, that forces us to talk about the very real concrete benefits that openness in research or education or open data more broadly provides. And so, echoing some of my fellow co-panelists, I think one of the most powerful things we can do is collect those narratives, those stories about not just why this is theoretically powerful, but the actual use cases that flow from this bill and its strong implementation, and celebrate those, and make sure the agencies whose data is being built on top of are aware of those wins, as well as the broader community and the media as well.
Great. So building off that, open in order to, what are the other kind of, now that we have this main foundation for open data, what are the other niche areas where legislation would be beneficial for increasing the openness or utility or availability of this kind of data? So, Kristen, if you could talk about the GREAT Act that Kilmer mentioned, or are there any opportunities in the research space, such as, results to publicly funded research that aren't as open as they could or should be, and that we can now point to this law as, well, we have to do this now because this is a law, or we should, yeah.
Yeah, so the GREAT Act stands for Grant Reporting Efficiency and Agreements Transparency Act. It's kind of a tortured acronym. But basically, this is a law that's codifying a pilot project that was established under the Data Act. So for 3 years, HHS was tasked under the Data Act to go out there and find all the forms that recipients of federal grants must report back up to their respective agencies. And they found over 440 forms. And across those forms, somewhere between 80 and 90,000 unique data elements on those forms. And a bunch of hardworking people at HHS worked very hard and built the CEDAR library, which is housed under usaspending.gov. And on there, you can see 34,000 unique data elements that have been harmonized down from that initial pool of data elements. So that's something as simple as, how do we collect a street address? It's amazing how many different ways you can create a way of collecting that information. So the GREAT Act would codify that work and basically task OMB and a lead grant-making agency like HHS to go about and create a common schema for the common data elements that grant recipients must report. And this is a lot of money moving around. This is $700 billion of grants awarded in FY17 to 40,000 grant recipients. And we've heard anecdotally somewhere between 30 and 50% of a grant recipient's time and resources are spent just on the compliance, reporting on how they're using the information. And if we can create that data structure, then the private sector can come and build the TurboTax of grant compliance and powerful kind of task management tools, and just make that whole process easier and more automated so we can get the most out of our federal tax dollars.
On the research side, I don't know how many folks are involved in or sort of currently active in the research space, but it's a really interesting time. There's a lot of change underway as sort of the research community adopts digital tools and distribution of the internet for particularly research outputs. And traditionally, the research community is focused on, sort of the article as sort of the coin of the realm, that for online distribution, it's just largely in flat PDFs, but the internet's sort of fundamentally changing what's possible, and there's a huge amount of value in the research data that's collected, but then often never shared. And there's increasing movement, even by some academic publications, to require that data is made available along with articles, but there's a long way to go in actually making that really function as effectively as it should. And I was just at a conference this past weekend in Portland, and one of the researchers that was there is doing cancer research, and there was an interesting data set that was published along with an article that he was interested in, but the data was in a PDF. And so he's going through trying to recreate like a usable data file from this PDF, and then just ended up giving up. And I think that's pretty common, unfortunately. And so, SPARC is very interested in trying to shift the default for research data to also be open and machine readable. So I think, again, as I said at the beginning, our interest in the Open Government Data Act is in those really strong definitions of what open licensing is, what machine readability requires, and I think there'll need to be subsequent policymaking that's specific to research data that handles things like disciplinary differences and making data accessible in useful ways to researchers that will need to take the next steps. But I think this is a really important step forward in terms of just making the expectation that data be open by default.
And then I think one of the unconventional vehicles for sort of pushing these open data principles could be free trade agreements. So one of the things we were pleased to see in the digital trade chapter of the recently renegotiated NAFTA, the USMCA, was that it included an open government data provision that essentially requires each of the US, Canada, and Mexico to endeavor to ensure that when they're releasing government data, they do so under open licenses and using machine-readable formats. The Trump administration's, of course, announced that they're going to be pursuing several other FTAs in the next year or two with the UK and Japan, and then potentially the EU. So we'd love to see this provision in there and potentially explore opportunities for building upon it to make sure that governments are providing data to everyone on equal terms, and that they're not using government policies to favor sort of domestic industry or anything like that.
Yes, one thing that I'd like to see in terms of next steps is we produce a lot of studies and evaluations for government agencies that are contracted and may never see publicly the light of day. And I can give you plenty of examples in Republican and Democratic administrations. So this is not associated with a political party. It's associated with a lot of inertia inside agencies, or maybe struggles grappling with the findings of studies. But as we're making better use of these data, we're going to start to see more studies and evaluations as a consequence of that. And in fact, referring to some of the other parts of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, also includes new evaluation officers. So yet another role that agencies are going to have to develop in a construct called a learning agenda. So setting a research and evaluation strategic plan, essentially. And if we are successful in doing that, we'll see more evaluation happening across government. And I think one of the things that I fear is that we won't develop the right mechanisms to actually make those reports that agencies are producing or contracting publicly available. So, coming up with a sort of broader framework around how we not just make the data available, but also when we're doing these summary analyses inside government, to the extent possible when we can, making those available as well.
Yep.
Just one other thing to add on there, just think of text as data. I mean, there's a whole world of management memorandums. The U.S. House is now drafting bills in U.S. legislative markup language. It's a version of XML, so we can see auto redlining and things happen there. So, think about not just like the numbers and the kind of mission programmatic data, but think about just all this stuff that could be more searchable.
Great. So continuing on that theme of opportunities where we can kind of take the success and apply it in other areas, we talked about open data on the international stage, the role that the U.S. government can play there, but what about in other branches of government? So we're seeing a push for increased use of open data or better data management practices on the legislative side. There was a lot of news on Twitter this week about frustrations with the PACER system in the judicial system. And there's also, ever since M1313, state and local governments have kind of followed suit and developed their own open data policies modeled after the federal governments. They can share it on their own portals or on data.gov. How can the federal government help in those areas, or how can we help as advocates kind of apply these principles more broadly? Anyone? Yeah.
Sure. So one of the great things that the federal government does is a fair amount of, whether it's through grants or through other sort of cost-sharing means, it ultimately pays for large IT systems for certain federally backed programs that happen to be administered at the state level. I'm thinking Medicare and Medicaid information systems, child welfare systems, a lot of things that HHS pays for. And I can very much think about, at the federal level, the opportunity to set some guidelines and some broader policies for what the state level systems should have in them. And the trickle down effects of those could be pretty powerful. Again, if it's a 90-10 match where the federal government is, coming to the table with 90% of the funds, they certainly can attach strings to it, and often do. And I think to the extent that there is open data language or data use language in there, that could be open. That could be really powerful.
Anything else? All right. After the bill cleared the House and Senate and it was waiting for the president to sign it, there was what I thought kind of strange outburst of advocacy urging the president to veto the bill on the grounds that the Open Government Data Act would be some sort of massive privacy risk, where it would require the government to publish all the sensitive data about Americans, about children, in a kind of nefarious Big Brother style way. That's of course not true, but how do we kind of deal with the sensitivities around data that's kind of happening in this public zeitgeist, and how do we make policymakers or administrators of these open data programs aware of what the best practices are, what the governance systems in place to ensure that we're doing this in a way that doesn't actually harm Americans?
So I guess in response to the question and the framing around the campaign that existed on Twitter a few weeks ago, I mean, there's no doubt in my mind, and hopefully for none of you, that privacy is important in our country. And to the extent we're talking about data, that underneath whatever is released are people or businesses that have some inherent expectation of confidentiality in certain realms. We should expect our government to be protecting those data, particularly when we pledge that we're going to protect them. And I think there will almost inevitably always be some fears about what government is doing with data. And to the extent we can make accountability and transparency mechanisms work effectively in government, it helps mitigate some of the concerns that might be raised, particularly in the uninformed space, where there's some new thing happening and it's complex, as this legislation was highly complex. When you sit down and read it, it opens the door for what we should expect to be really important and productive conversations about how we're guaranteeing privacy to the extent possible. The Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking specifically tackled this challenge, and it was one of the core themes of their final report and the set of recommendations. And if you look at the entirety of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that there's a way to conclude it's not a net improvement for privacy. It includes something under Title III called the Confidential Information Protection and Statistical Efficiency Act, so yet another mouthful of a title. But it guarantees that when we pledge confidentiality for certain data collections, that you're under risk of civil and criminal penalties for violating that, and they're massive: 5 years in prison, $250,000 in fines. I mean, these are not a joke. I mean, there's a reason why in our federal statistical agencies you don't hear about misuses of data, and it's because they have built a culture of being very protective of the data that they hold that have a lot of sensitive information attached to them. So what does that mean for going forward? I think it means, one, you should expect that we're going to be talking about privacy and the important role of privacy in using data going forward, and honestly, we need to. Two, we need to always be ensuring that we're thinking about transparency and accountability mechanisms. So to the extent government is collecting and using data, being able to explain what it is we're doing with those data. I mean, to the earlier point that Nick made, developing use cases that explain at a very basic level what are the benefits of using and analyzing these data. I think that helps build the case not just for policymakers and agencies, but also for the public writ large in understanding what it is we're doing and why this is actually an improvement for society.
Okay. Yes. All right, so I'm going to answer one or two more questions and kick it over to the audience. I will admit, normally when we do these kind of panels, they're on a little bit more contentious issues, and we can have people that are on both sides of the debate, but there's only one side of the debate here, and that's pro-open data. So I'm glad everyone's agreeing with each other. But it makes for harder to come up with interesting questions. So we touched on this a little bit. If you do business with the government, you're a cloud provider, you provide IT systems, or you manage data in some way, what do you need to be aware of now that this is the law? Do you actually have to change your business practices or your licensing practices? Are you going to be hurt by this? Are you going to be helped by this? What does this mean for kind of the broader contracting community?
As the loan procurement person on the panel, I guess I have to take this. To tell you the truth, I'm not sure it will change much. To the extent that M1313 has been around, folks who have been contracting for data, I think will continue to do so. I don't see this particularly changing the nature of contracts for any technology services that the U.S. government does. I think to the extent that there'll be greater compliance with a federal source code policy, or for net new custom software development, there may be new sections added to different contracts or new provisions added, but I don't see it for cut solutions or for cloud or anything like that.
Yeah, it's important to sort of emphasize that the bill creates a presumption of openness. It doesn't sort of require a 100% requirement that everything the government does has to be made immediately available to the public. So, of course, there are protections to ensure that sensitive identifiable information about individuals will not be made available. Things that, if making something available would violate contracts, that's not going to be subject to the open mandate. So it's not going to sort of have an effect on the contracts themselves, but I think it's going to have an important effect on the government's awareness of the value of the data it has and the value of the data that is created when a vendor is performing a service on its behalf. So during the negotiations of contracts going forward, I think that awareness may play out in sort of how those negotiations happen, and the government will likely, in recognizing that value, be less likely to sort of sign away valuable data to their vendors.
True. Has that happened before? Okay.
Not from any BSA company.
Okay, gotcha. Of course. So actually with that, I will open up to questions a little bit. We may come back to some moderated questions towards the end here. But please raise your hand if you have a question. I believe, do we have a mic, or we have... Yeah, we'll have a mic come to you. Please say your name and the organization that you're with. And then also, if you are watching online, please tweet your questions, and we'll be sure to address those as well. So just put your hand up, and we should have a mic to you.
Hi, my name is Ardiaku. I'm in private practice. I had this is about agencies that make rulings. So I came from the patent office. There's like 7,000 people that work there. They write 100,000, rulings a year. Each one of those is 10 to 30 pages. That agency publishes all of it, but it's hidden behind a CAPTCHA, and all the rulings are in TIFF format for the very real privacy concerns of the bureaucrats that write them. Like, you didn't want, a reporter to find out the name of this person, find out how they rule, their individual allowance rates and that kind of stuff, all of which the government keeps. But what kind of protections are in the law that prevent that kind of data mining?
So that's a very specific example. And I guess maybe one of the things I would say here at the outset is there are going to be a lot of very complicated discussions working through the entirety of the federal government to deal with issues exactly like this. I think one of the core things that's in the law that is just good for awareness to know is that it is not a mandate to publish everything that you have. It is a mandate to have open government to the extent, or open data to the extent it makes sense. So there are a whole suite of instances where we know there are sensitive or confidential data that we should not be making public for some specific reason. I don't know enough about that particular example to say that's right or wrong, but I mean, think about something like the Social Security Administration. They're making determinations about people's retirement claims or disability insurance claims. And that's a very personal discussion where there's a lot of personal medical information that's involved. They're not going to be making every single one of those determinations publicly available. But that doesn't mean they can't make summary information available. So if they're administrative law judges, we could see their rates of determinations. And in fact, SSA, to give them credit, does make some of that information accessible on their website today. I think we're going to most certainly see cases where we have better information about some of the summary level customer service indicators that are relevant for us as a consequence of this law. I would not necessarily go as far to say that every single determination that government makes, you're going to immediately see some information about it. In fact, I think there are plenty of cases where we most certainly don't want that to happen. That would be non-FOIable information, sensitive for a whole host of reasons, and OMB and the agencies are going to have to make determinations about what fits in that category versus what doesn't.
Sure.
This is outside of sort of the direct sort of area where SPARC works on, but not to sort of turn my participation on this panel into like a romp through SPARC's phrasebook, but there's one that we use, that's about making sort of research data sort of as open as possible, but as closed as necessary. And I think that's a good way to think about, what this bill does, is that we, want to make it as open as possible, but there's plenty of data that shouldn't be openly accessible, that shouldn't be public. And so, for us, this bill's about changing the default, but that doesn't mean that everything becomes open.
And just because something isn't ultimately disclosed on a data inventory, that doesn't mean that the principles of open data don't have internal benefits as well. So we would hope that the data, internally agencies are still going around trying to structure things and put it into formats that if it was then subject to FOIA and had to disclose it, would be more accessible or usable when that does happen.
Great.
One thing I might add, just in response to the question, since we went there, I think when you take Title I and Title III of the bill together, there is a very clear expectation that agencies are increasingly analyzing their confidential administrative records. So to the extent possible, under really stringent confidentiality protections, when you need personal identifiers there to maybe combine data sets across different programs to get the outcomes of interest that that you need to answer whatever the question is, there is a presumption of accessibility that's actually built into Title III of the law for confidential records, but for agencies that explicitly use that authority. So that doesn't, again, mean that everything is going to be accessible even in that confidential space. But I mean, building on, I already forgot the phrase that you used that I love, but I think it's the
as open as possible, as closed as necessary.
Yeah, I mean that
can tweet that
that is very much the expectation that was built across the entirety of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act.
Yep.
Yes, good afternoon. John Bird with the National Society of Professional Surveyors, NSPS. I was hoping to piggyback on Christian's reference to geospatial. Towards the end of last year, another bill that did move was the Geospatial Data Act, known as the GDA. And the Congressional Research Service has indicated up to 90% of government data has a geospatial component to it. So the question is the construct, the new items that the open data bill put into play, and how our friends at the Federal Geographic Data Committee, the FGDC, and the National Geospatial Advisory Committee, the NGAC, what kind of advice or counsel would you recommend on geospatial data as it's being implemented by the different, I guess, new CIOs or additional CIOs?
Yeah, so Title II of the bill applies to all federal executive agencies, so the CDO Council will be kind of much more broader than the CFO or CIO Council that's just pertaining to CFO Act agencies, the large 24 departmental agencies. So that the CDO Council necessarily have kind of working groups kind of formed around either kind of practice areas or types of data or different kind of standard setting activities. So, you know, I could envision geospatial having kind of a seat at that table through agencies where that's a primary concern. So kind of focusing attention at the CDO Council is the way I would go.
So federal data strategy. There have already been conversations I know happening at OMB about ensuring all of these various efforts are synced together. So I don't have a specific brilliant answer about the geospatial connection other than I know for a fact folks at OMB are conscious, they're planning for it. And I, again, would just encourage that you stay plugged in on the data strategy and that the geospatial community do that because it will be yet another promising vehicle for ensuring all these pieces actually align.
All the questions are on that half.
Hi, Gavin Baker at the American Library Association. We're really excited to be co-host of this event. Thanks to the Center for Data Innovation for hosting and to the panelists for leading really interesting discussion and their great advocacy on this issue. So at the beginning of the panel, Representative Kilmer talked about how to get the data that will be released into the hands of folks like school teachers who could use it. And I think for an audience like that to drive that kind of use and that kind of benefit from the data, simply posting an inscrutable file on a website with no explanation and telling nobody about it is not really going to help them. So my question to the panelists under the theme of what's next is what good practices have you seen within government agencies in terms of outreach to potential data users and engagement of the audiences that might benefit from this data to make them aware of the resources that they're going to make available and to interact with them and make sure that the products that they're providing are really useful and can be used by the broadest possible audience?
I mean, I've been in many meetings at Treasury where they were bringing in specific groups they knew were going to be aggregating their bulk download capabilities under usaspending.gov and making sure that changes they were going to be pushing out in 3 months really made sense to their systems. And similarly for SEC, designing their taxonomy for corporate disclosure with an eye towards the data aggregators, looking towards agencies that have already been doing this for a while and kind of understand heavy use APIs or bulk download and going to them and saying, how did you stand that up and make sure that it worked for the economy?
And furthermore, going back to a point I made earlier about this being human-centered, different agencies have different stakeholder sets, and those stakeholders may require different avenues in terms of outreach. Maybe some folks are super cool just going to a website and downloading a bulk data set with no descriptions, and maybe other folks need a sort of systematic stakeholder engagement effort. And I think to the extent that as agencies look to implement this law, there's an opportunity to do formal stakeholder engagement and apply human-centered design principles to the implementation. I think that's where we'll really learn what different stakeholders want and what those school teachers really need and how they're going to consume that data.
Yep, and another aspect of the bill that hasn't really been discussed is that there, within the Chief Data Officer Council, there is a requirement that they create procedures and processes to engage the public sector, the NGO community, and private industry to determine what sorts of data are most valuable to them and how they can make it available in ways that are most useful. So I think that's going to be an important aspect of the bill, as is congressional oversight of how all of these things are ultimately implemented.
There are tons of agencies that do this well today. And we have a lot of good models that we can look at. I mentioned the Census Bureau earlier. They're almost 14 months from the 2020 census, and they've already started the really intense discussions with stakeholder communities and potential users, and they've been doing this for quite a while about what we'd like to see come out on the other side of the census for that are useful data products. I think the best we can do is look to the places that today are already good models and statistical agencies, different corners of HHS. I think 18F has built a lot of expertise on this in the last few years, and the U.S. Digital Service. So I think that's that's promising to me that we're not starting blind here. That we've got good best practices to build from.
I'd also like to point out on the local government level, to the extent that certain communities have started publishing their own open data portals, we've seen a lot of really interesting ways to make data that is relevant to like the average person more useful. So even in Montgomery County about 3 or 4 years ago, they launched a data visualization portal. They had open data for a while where they publish all their spending, but they had a visualization portal where if you were concerned that your county's spending too much on snowplows, you can visualize how much they spent on snowplows over the past 5 years. You don't have to download any data sets. You don't have to be a data scientist to actually get value from this data. And I think we'll start to see more of that happen on a much larger scale. So, well, there's enough time to get to everyone's questions, hopefully, so we're going to go and then come to this side. So, was there anyone over here?
Hi there, Jory Heckman with Federal News Network. Nick, you had mentioned this briefly, but I wanted to see if the panel could elaborate on this a little bit further. You had mentioned the Chief Evaluation Officer, and just thoughts on how they might interact with the Chief Data Officer, and maybe more generally, whether, if the leadership is there, whether there's maybe a talent gap in the rank and file of these people being able to carry out some of the implementation of this bill.
Well, maybe I can go first and you all can fill in. So we know collaboration in government is really hard, but it's also really important. And the broad vision here is that the different CXO folks across federal agencies are going to work together. We need them to work together. We need the CFOs and the CIOs to work with the CDOs, and we need the evaluation officers to work with the COOs. I can do this for a long time. There's a lot of chiefs out there. But the point is, they all have really important functions and roles to play in government. And I think one of the reasons we've seen the emergence of different chiefs over recent years is that we need to make sure those different functions are prioritized among senior leaders. So the addition of an evaluation officer in the legislation, which was one of the recommendations out of the Commission on Evidence-Based Policymaking, was specifically to have someone who can facilitate the use of data, but that also the use of the results that come out of evaluations. So by having a senior leader in key agencies that fills that, and it's honestly a gap, we'll ultimately see more use of evidence to inform policymaking. Similarly, we already talked about the role of the CDOs, and it's not to say it was a gap in every single agency, but clearly if you looked across the federal government, there were places we weren't adequately planning for how we were going to use data, how we're going to improve data quality. If you put just the CDO and the evaluation officer in a room together, the conversations they could have would be fascinating, right? So what are the important questions that we need to answer so that the next time Congress reauthorizes a program, they have the information they need? If you've got the CDO talking about data collection and the evaluator talking about the ultimate use of an evaluation, that's how we make the use of evidence in policymaking real.
And the CDOs have to kind of manage agency data management plans, so that might incorporate some of the questions being asked in the evaluation plans. And there is a requirement in the law that the two, C-suite guys interact. So we're supposed to coordinate. Yeah. Or gals. Yes. Or gals. Right.
Where's Mike? Oh. Yep.
Hi, panelists. This is Megan Stussy from the Congressional Research Service. I very much appreciate your thoughts on creating and using government information. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on version control or for archiving the government information once it's been released. Thanks.
Not specifically. I think that one of the important metadata elements that needs to be accounted for is how often a data resource is going to be updated, so that before anyone relies on it, they know when it was last versioned and when it is likely to be updated again. But I think beyond that, I'm not sure that I have much to offer.
I would just say that modern commercial cloud capabilities mean that now it's not particularly expensive for folks, for agencies to host old versions of their data in order to sort of get better versioning and better sort of records. And so whereas that sort of thing used to require folks building data centers and the like, now private industry sort of solved that problem, which has been great.
So not surprisingly, this is a big question for researchers about when we start talking about reproducibility and replication, being able to have access to the same data that whoever you're replicating used for their study. And I once gave an off-the-cuff response that was something to the effect of, gee, wouldn't that be a nice problem to have? And I think we're finally to the point where we recognize, like, okay, we're going to be there soon. So I think there's no doubt in my mind that archiving is going to be important. I don't think we've necessarily got all of the precise ways down to do it across the federal government, but that's got to be an important part of implementing this law. And I mean, I think the technology is certainly capable of helping us do this as we go forward.
Hey, Alex Howard, independent for the moment, but I did work on this for a while. I was at the Sunlight Foundation, and there are people who worked in this bill for a long time. Thank you for the Center for Data Innovation, for all the people here. I think I see Hudson Hollister in the back, who worked on this early on years ago. So thank you to everybody. It's a big deal, and thank you for that. What I wanted to say, though, is that there's a difference between open government and open data, as you all know. And you said, who's against this? Well, how much open data is there of White House visitor logs online right now? Is the USDA APHIS division still putting up animal welfare inspection reports or not? That data has been taken offline. I just came from the House Oversight Committee yesterday, or heard people talking about putting campaign donations and who paid for information online as a form of doxing. Of course, that is open data disclosed by our FEC. So whenever the data inconveniences people in power, there are indeed people against it. Now we have right now an acting people across government, acting chief of staff, used to be over at OMB. When he was there, he commented that one of the most important examples of open data that has benefited the consumer, disclosing consumer complaints from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau online, which led to lower credit card fees, isn't good. It's not a good thing. We don't want to see that. And of course, he commented that to an industry group. So there are people who don't want open data to be online if it doesn't benefit people in power, or if it reveals how power is being wielded, right? And who claim that White House visitor logs put people at risk and are dangerous, even though there are 6 million of them online, still at the National Archives, which have done none of that. So what I'd ask to all of you is, what does this law do to change that dynamic in any way? Because as you well know, we had a negotiation that this would be harmonized with FOIA. So people still have to sue to get government to disclose. Is the only difference now that what's in the FOIA reading rooms will be machine readable?
You know, it does not solve all the problems that you've identified. I mean, that's a fact. I think it gives us a hook, and it's incremental progress, but certainly I think continued vigilance from the Sunlight Foundation, from NGOs, from industry, from the public in general is going to be critically important going forward. I do think it provides an important lever for Congress, at least to do some oversight on agencies when we hear news along the lines that you've just talked about. But beyond that, I don't think that we should, you know, this is not a panacea. It's an important step, but it's not going to solve all these problems.
So there's no doubt OMB has a big role to play here. So again, harkening back to the federal data strategy, OMB is going to have to issue guidance and, in some cases, regulations as a consequence of this law, and help agencies do all of the things that are intended. To the extent OMB doesn't do what you or the broad public or the intent of the law is, I think it's incumbent on congressional staff, members of Congress, to use their oversight mechanisms to really ensure that when we're talking about open data, that we're prioritizing and actually fulfilling the intent of what they passed overwhelmingly, unanimous in the Senate, overwhelmingly passed in the House. So I think we'll likely see some oversight from House Oversight and Government Reform, Homeland Security and Government Affairs in the Senate, and my hope is that every other authorizing committee, the appropriators, I mean, this is going to take a really big collective effort across the congressional apparatus to do good oversight. There's just so much to be done here, and we know government has tons of data, much of which is not accessible today, and this is not going to be a fast thing. So at the same time I'm saying this, we also know agencies are going to have to prioritize how they actually undertake implementation. So again, this is my appeal to the stakeholder community, that when you have a priority, that we make that known, use the data strategy vehicle to directly tell OMB what you think is important that's not happening today. You'll have opportunities to provide every single agency that's implementing feedback, and use your voice to make sure that the priorities that you think they should be undertaking are the ones that they're taking the first steps on.
And the bill also gives you a person at an agency to go to, a chief data officer, to handle a lot of these requests. And hopefully this will kind of take those issues and make them more proactive, in that Congress will have the ability to say, yes, there's an information gap, calls the CDO before them and asks more about why is that the case. And while OMB will be issuing guidance, the law requires the agencies to abide by that guidance. So it's not just guidance.
Great.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Andrea Gibbons. I'm with Booz Allen Hamilton, and we talked a lot today about publishing of data that's meant to be open, but also in the law it talks about the implementation of a comprehensive data catalog. So in what way are you defining what metadata from a business perspective is going to be there in the lineage down to the sets of data that are going to be published?
Yeah, so every agency will have the data inventories, which is where the data will reside, and then the federal data catalog kind of is where all that maps up to, and GSA will maintain that. So
are you going to have a business metadata description of the data asset in those catalogs and then publish?
Yes.
Okay.
And then there'll be this, it's described in the law as a repository of best practices, and that will kind of accompany all of this as well. So that'll help from a government-wide perspective guide what the agencies are putting in the inventories.
Okay.
Got a couple behind you.
Hi, I'm Amy Burnett Cross. I'm a PhD student at American University, and I just came from federal service a year ago. As a young government analyst who really cared a lot about open data and reproducibility practices, sometimes I found that my work kind of fell on deaf ears. And so I'm wondering to what extent this new legislation changes that dynamic and provides more opportunities for pathways and young professionals who maybe already have the ethics that we're interested in kind of fostering here, and giving them an opportunity to kind of shine within their agencies or show what can be done.
Sure. So I'll start. Back to what Christian was saying earlier, this is a really great first step, and it gives proactive authority to agency, whereas I think before, the M-Series memo, it's really great when OMB says to do stuff, but I think then agencies, prioritize it amongst their other unfunded mandates and, sort of make a judgment call. But I think to the extent that your question is more about employee empowerment, I think this is a really spectacular opportunity for employees and program offices and the like to feel as though they have the legislative authority to go out and do a thing, whereas before that authority was essentially lacking, or you could really only point to the authority coming from an M-Series memo. So to the extent that this is an opportunity to do more, I think it's a step in the right direction, but it's not a perfect solution that's going to lead to change management or government transformation overnight.
And with, not to beat a dead horse, but I think the CDO position is going to be a really important to help shifting the culture within agencies. For the first time, we'll have someone at every agency whose job it is to evangelize the importance of open data and to communicate to his or her colleagues why they should be, constructing whatever their workflows are in a way that can facilitate greater agency and cross-government use of data and reproducibility. So at a minimum, it's creating at least one person in an agency that young researchers like yourself will be able to go to when you have concerns about the way agency government's procedures are being sort of carried out.
So the law tries to change culture in government, which is really hard to do. You can't legislate it, but you can set up the capacity and the processes to make culture change real. So I think echoing these points, this is exactly what you see in this law. And to the extent there are people inside agencies today that haven't felt empowered because they had to lean on a 2013 memo from OMB or some kind of generic guidance or statement, they have a law to lean on now, which carries a whole lot more weight for program managers, program administrators, members of the senior executive service, political appointees, even across agencies. They have to do it. And so we're not going to see the capacity necessarily built overnight. It's going to definitely take time, and therefore we also know the culture change will take a little bit longer to materialize as well. But this is a starting point. And I think just echoing Congressman Kilmer, it's not the end point. It's going to take a lot of work, and it doesn't mean every agency is necessarily going to get it right out the gate. But if we can start incrementally moving everybody in compliance with the provisions of this law, we'll build the workforce, we'll engage in the right kind of training and education, including for senior execs that now need to understand what all of these important concepts mean and why when we walk in a room and we start talking about data, they should pay attention. So my hope is that this is the starting point of a sea change in that culture, including a really important element of the workforce.
At risk of providing an overly specific answer, there's a fantastic law professor at America named Michael Carroll who's actually involved behind the scenes in helping get the Open Government Data Act passed. But he actually raised that specific point last night at another celebration of this bill's passage, pointing exactly to chief data officer becoming a C-level position, sending a strong signal. But he was also very interested in the pathways for involvement that might open up, particularly for early career researchers and other early career folks to get involved. So he might be somebody you might want to connect with. Awesome.
We got time for one question, but it has to be very quick. Whoever had their hand up first, you guys can fight it out.
I guess I'm lucky the microphone was near me. I'm Clint Brass from the Congressional Research Service. One of the change management challenges maybe going forward is that when data sets become available, that the data may not be easily interpreted, and communities of practice oftentimes feel cautious about making data available because it can be easily misinterpreted, which suggests that there's going to be some capacity issues out there in packaging data so that it's not misunderstood. Can you talk about the challenges related to that, please?
Please keep it brief.
Yeah, again, going back to the Data Act, that's been a consistent challenge, and the extent to which they were very diligent in trying to figure out how to display the intricacies of public sector accounting for the layman or the public or journalists or Congress even has trouble with that. They really sat down and thought through profiles and did a lot of testing, and I think it's going to kind of be case by case in terms of what makes sense, but you have to involve the end user.
Great. So with that, it's right at 2:30. I believe the panelists want to stick around and answer any other questions. That's on them, but we're not going to make them. So again, I really want to thank BSA, the Internet Association, SPARC, the Bipartisan Policy Center, the Data Coalition, and the American Library Association, and then anyone else in the room or watching online that has helped get this over the finish line. Alex, Hudson, anyone else who I might be forgetting. This is a really major victory we should all be celebrating, as I know some of us did last night. But thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.